Broadcasting from the commodity capital of the world, Zurich, Switzerland, this is Insider's Guide to Energy.
This edition to Insider's Guide to Energy is brought to you by Fidectis. Go to www.fidectis.com for more information.
Welcome to Insider's Guide to Energy. I'm your host, Chris Sass, and with me this evening is Adam Kuehne. Adam, welcome to the program.
All right, thanks, Chris. Thanks for having me.
It's a pleasure to have you here. I'm excited. This is one of our last show. I think this is our last show of the 2020-2022 year. We're going into the holiday season, so thank you so much for joining us. And I am super excited to be talking solar today. We love the energy transition on the show. And I think it would make sense for you to maybe start by introducing yourself professionally, who you are and who you work for.
Yep, happy to. My name is Adam Kuehne. I'm the Chief Investment Officer of Summit Ridge Energy. I started my career in the U.S. Navy, primarily operating nuclear power plants on submarines. Did that for several years before deploying to the Middle East. When I left the service, I pivoted into finance through an MBA, a couple of years in New York at an investment bank. And for the better part of the last 8 or 9 years, I've been on the developer side of solar. So Summit Ridge Energy is a company founded in 2017, who is now the nation's leading owner-operator of community solar and storage assets. We're a national company. We've got a footprint in all of the major states in which community solar exists, which is an increasing number every day. Our strategy is really to get to scale within the markets that we operate in to really catalyze investment into the space.
So help me understand community solar. Help me understand what you mean by that. There's so many buzzwords in our industry. I think it's always fair to ask what I say is the dumb question. So please explain what you mean by community solar.
Yeah. So community solar is going to mean a little bit something different within the market that you're operating in. But at the highest level, you're talking about a form of net metering that allows for participation in clean energy by the entirety of a utility's rate base. So third-party owned systems, small solar systems that are interconnected at the distribution level, owned by companies like Summit Ridge Energy, that make the financial benefits of that solar directly available to households and small businesses within a utility service territory.
Okay, so that makes a lot of sense to me. Now, the obvious question in the preamble when we were speaking before we started recording, we talked a little bit about storage. So help me understand, because solar without storage is probably not that compelling. How does storage play into your play?
Sure. I think every market that opens up, and kind of looking backward, every iteration of a market that's already open is really necessitating storage either as a part of solar or as a complement to solar. So before the Inflation Reduction Act, which was passed this year, here in the States, the application of storage was really limited based on the economics. Essentially, you had to bundle the solar and the storage project together to make them appear as one, both physically to the grid, but also financially, facing the IRS. And so really that kind of presented limited use cases where the solar itself had to be directly tied to the storage, and it really kind of limited you in your application. But one of the many benefits of the Inflation Reduction Act was the eligibility of standalone storage for a standalone investment tax credit, which really opens up the application of storage across the entirety of the grid. Really, what we see is that as soon as a significant volume of solar is prevalent, right, represents a significant portion of a utility's generation source, you absolutely need storage to help moderate and manage the intermittency and the unpredictability of solar, as well as other intermittent renewable resources like wind. So it's essentially it's a complement, right? It's a way of shaping the production of solar, which is something that the current state of technology of solar and wind production doesn't allow for on its own.
And then, so grid scale storage, what are you seeing today? So we've done a number of storage episodes over the last few years. In the North American market today, what does grid scale storage mean to you?
Yeah, I think grid scale storage, look, that is a very rapidly maturing part of the energy space, right? A number of large developers emerged over the last 4 to 5 years who I think anticipated the need for storage at the grid level, right, at the transmission and high voltage level. These were both platforms that had background in project development, right, renewable and conventional asset project development, but also energy traders that started to see these phenomena in the markets that you can use storage really as an arbitrage opportunity, right? I think in certain markets like in Texas and ERCOT, there's also just physical observations you can make, in California as well with blackouts and brownouts. But what we've seen over the past, I'd say 3 to 4 years, is a really, really rapid maturation of that space. I think the most interesting part of that space to us as a distributed developer, though, are the applications of storage at the lower voltage and the distribution level, right? The systems that we're developing on the solar side range from 1 to 5 megs DC, interconnecting up to maybe 39 kV. But we're generally within the grid of a distribution utility. I think the unique thing that we bring, and that smaller storage project application brings to the distribution utility, is the ability to really precisely locate that storage relative to a utility's needs. And that's something that the large projects just can't do by their nature, right? 200 megawatt 4-hour systems that are sited at the largest substation, where massive energy is being imported. They can't serve that critical load. They can't offset capex that needs to be made, further down the chain, closer into the load pockets. That's something that we as a distributed developer have really in our toolkit now. And like I said, the Inflation Reduction Act really kind of supercharged that for us by separating solar from storage and really opening up the use case of storage on its own.
So are we beyond the point of rate shaping or shaving with storage, and it's actually delivering, or are we still using it for cost benefit?
It's going to range. It really ranges from market to market and utility to utility, right? And a lot of it goes back to market design, right? In ERCOT, for example, in the absence of a capacity market, it's an arbitrage opportunity, right? And you're charging when energy's low, and you're discharging when it's high, and you're basically sitting on a financial option, right? That's being dispatched into the grid physically through storage. We see a lot of other applications though in other markets that we operate in, such as New York. So some of the first battery projects that we'll turn on early next year are located within the 5 boroughs of Manhattan. They're smaller systems. They're close to 4 megs, but they're 4-hour duration systems where really Con Edison has sent a market signal to us as developers that says, here's where I need storage. If you build storage in these, hyper local pockets of my territory, here are the economics that are available to you over a 25-year period to go and get.
And then we talked about that. So you're talking about the economics, and you talked about the Inflation Reduction Act. How in the current economy is financing going? So the economy is not as healthy as it might have been if we talked a year or two ago. Obviously the Inflation Reduction Act pumped a lot of money into renewables, or opens a lot of opportunities, I guess, with credits and not necessarily money, but where you can go. How's the investment sentiment today? So if we go into January 2023, what's the market appetite for investing in these projects?
Yeah. I think it's as strong as ever. Certainly, there are headwinds that we didn't face over the last 5 to 6 years. Those are macro headwinds with just global instability. But rising interest rates is something that we haven't had to consider for the better part of 7 or 8 years. And so I think the Inflation Reduction Act really, as a tailwind to kind of offset those headwinds, serve to really offset any decreasing interest that we would have seen from global investors. I think the signal has been sent, here certainly domestically, that there's a long runway now, right? That the Inflation Reduction Act has really enabled a long runway of renewable project development and investment opportunity, where you don't have to play the game that many of us played over the last decade of fits and starts, right? Anticipating extensions that wouldn't come, or trying to perfectly craft a solar plus storage project that would check all of the boxes of the IRS. I think the playing field is very level across all renewable energy technologies now. There's still some guidance that we await, right, around some of the specifics of how to actually achieve some of the opportunity that's present within the Inflation Reduction Act. But I think it was certainly a well-timed catalyst to the space. That was needed irrespective of what some of those tailwinds were. But I think in the face of all those tailwinds, it couldn't have come at a better time.
And then, what states are the most legislatively friendly, or what utilities have the ability to deal with a distributed environment today and have the I guess the rules or the regulation behind it to be most friendly to this development?
Sure. So the biggest overlap we see is whether or not a state allows for a deregulated utility versus a fully regulated utility or not. So, geographically, that generally means that states in the Northeast, the Mid-Atlantic, the Midwest, and certain parts of the West, already have retail choice available to the customers, where the distribution utility who's physically responsible for the wires, right, and moving energy, to your household or to your small business, they are not necessarily going to be actually generating the power, owning the projects and generating the power that you consume. 20 plus years ago, 30 plus years ago, when deregulation took hold, certain markets, went all in, right? So you think ISO New England, New York, PJM, and certain markets like in the Southeast didn't, right? And so certain of these stakeholders, right, the utilities, the ratepayer advocates, the public utilities commissions, are already very familiar with third-party owned systems, right, independent power producers, retail choice providers, to where community solar slots into those market structures a lot easier and a lot more seamlessly than it would if you're living in Georgia and Georgia Power is the only source of electricity that you can get.
So what's an ideal setup for community solar? What do you look for? So if you were going to send me a prospectus and say, hey, we're going to go do this project, what's the ideal community you're looking for?
Yeah, I think the characteristics that we look for first and foremost are at the market level. So we want to see policies that are enacted that are well defined, that have long runways for development, that are scalable enough that can really justify us making a significant investment within that state over a prolonged period of time. Not just a financial investment, but a boots on the ground investment, right? Physically, opening offices, putting staff, boots on the ground to develop, then to build, and then to manage the projects, that we'll build in that state. And so, once we see all those characteristics, we're really drilling in on the details of how do we get to the ratepayer. What are the economics available to us as a project developer that really create the financial opportunity that we'll be making an investment into? Is the entirety of that rate base available? Can we subscribe, residential customers only, or do we also have the opportunity to subscribe small, medium, and large commercial customers? Are there special provisions that help us to access low to moderate income customers, which historically was only really a feature of the state level programs, but now with the Inflation Reduction Act obviously has its own incentives. So really, it's what are the broad strokes of the market, but then really at the very detailed level, how are we actually going to make this, the benefits of community solar available to every single ratepayer within the broadest swath of that utility territory as we possibly can. From there, it's really an evaluation of, what does the landscape of contractors look like? How much is it going to cost to build and maintain these systems? What does the supply chain look like to get the modules and the transformers and the inverters and, to build these systems on time? It's what is the landscape of, retail providers, as well as, aggregator partners. How easy do we think it'll be to actually subscribe these systems? So I think a very unique feature about community solar is, we very quickly in our company's history went to guaranteed savings models. So essentially, our value proposition to the customer is you will buy bill credits from our project, and we will only charge you a guaranteed discount against the value of that bill credit. But it's still actually it's a costly and sometimes tedious process to actually convince customers that they should want to save money with no money out of pocket, right? No investment, month-to-month termination, very, very consumer-friendly proposition. It's still, and this is really an artifact, I would say, of market design. The more bureaucratic and Byzantine that you make that process, the more difficult it is to actually bring the savings to the customer, because there are so many levels of bureaucracy and paperwork and box checking that you need to do before you can actually physically get that power onto the grid and financially make the benefits of that community solar available to the customer.
So I think I just heard you say that community solar, in your customer signs up, you're guaranteeing them or telling them there's going to be a discount, but there's no commitment on their point for term. So they're not signing a multi-year term with you. They go month to month with you.
Absolutely. Certainly with residential customers, where, from a consumer protection perspective, the idea of pitching, a family or, a single family household on making a 20 or 30-year investment in our projects is not something that we want to undertake, right? There are other technologies, other companies who can do that with rooftop solar, with storage, household storage, and they have a certain swath, I would say, of the market that
those target upper middle class and better, right? I mean, if you look at the average cost of a home, if I'm going to put rooftop solar on and battery storage, I have to have a certain disposable income to do that, right? So if you look at the average American income, you're probably not doing that. You're probably going to someone like you guys.
That's exactly right? Because for those systems, either they're looking to sell the system, right, to a household, for which that household needs the money. And then moreover, they also need the taxable income, right, to be able to efficiently use the tax credit that's available to them. In lieu of buying the system, those customers are really going to be signing up for a long-term agreement, either through a power purchase agreement, a lease, or a loan agreement, where the nature of that consumer financing really lends itself only to the most, creditworthy of customers. Really, one of the hallmarks of community solar is that since this is virtual, right, since we have access to the entirety of a utility's rate base, all of the customers within it, to the extent that a customer defaults or moves or forgets about their subscription and just stops paying, it's very easy for us in the next month of our production to suspend allocating bill credits to them and just reorient those bill credits to another customer. So our value proposition is exactly that, Chris. It's with no money down, with no long-term commitment, with a month-to-month cancellation right, we can guarantee that if your utility bill were X, the value of the bill credits that we apply against it, we will only charge you a certain percent against that, right? So we're guaranteeing you savings on a month-to-month basis.
Okay, but you also said in your earlier conversation that you partner with the utilities, right? You're providing this service for the utilities. And so you're kind of cannibalizing their income. So how excited are they that you're coming in and undercutting them?
Well, I would disagree that we're undercutting. I don't necessarily agree that we're cannibalizing. I think in most well-designed programs, what you see is that the utilities can actually recover the costs of these programs, right? So to the extent that they have to make significant investments in their technology infrastructure, for example, or they've got to bring on another 100-person staff just to manage this program, they have a right per statute, right, per these programs, to recover those costs from the entirety of their rate base. And while in certain markets, the value of our energy may be at the full retail rate, no different than, an existing net metering program for rooftop solar. What you see there also is that subject to certain net metering caps, the utility does have the right to recover the added costs from the entirety of the rate base. So I think there's just a general bias away from change at utilities, which anyone who's ever interfaced with regulated utilities would agree with, right? Because they're monopolies, right? There's the status quo of how business has been done for the last 30 years. And we are not necessarily a threat, but we can be an annoyance, I would say. So really, that's another feature that we look to when we look to these markets is, what does the utility landscape look like? Have these utilities, by their common ownership, with other utilities, already seen community solar programs, already kicked the tires, already learn lessons? How receptive and how good of a partner will they be to the learning curve that is inherent in building a community solar program?
So a couple of things come to mind. The first is, we're talking solar, and even in your earlier comments, you said wind and solar seem to be popular renewables. I mean, there's probably some other choices, but probably less mainstream. So how does community solar play with all these wind projects that are going on, or other projects, renewable?
Yeah, I mean, look, when it's bundled with the grid, obviously in most markets, it's a natural complement, right? What you see in most markets is that the production from solar, the profile, the solar production profile is a nice complement to wind, where as solar is ramping down, generally wind is ramping up, right? That can also be true seasonally, right? In certain markets, it's not necessarily going to be true, and what you see as an attractive solar resource in one market just may not have an attractive wind resource that can interconnect and produce within that market. So I think, like I mentioned when I talked about the Inflation Reduction Act, now that there's a level playing field for technologies, not just between solar and wind, but also new forms of renewable energy and new fuel sources, including hydrogen, standalone battery storage, I think what you're going to see is an increased appetite from all of these stakeholders to let all sources of renewable energy generation onto the grid, because you're not going to have to allow one at the sake of the other now, right? You can look at all of these sources of generation really as a basket, right? An uncorrelated basket, especially with storage, right? That can be used to kind of shape that production to meet your end users' needs.
All right, so I buy that. We talked in the pre-call a little bit about the finance angle. How are these deals getting done? What kind of magnitude are these deals? And I said my off the cuff was, are they PPA? And you said, well, not really. There's some avenues to do things. So how are these companies financing these deals, or how's the community financing these?
So when we launched as a company, we had the ambition of financing community solar at scale. We knew that for community solar to achieve the possibilities that the market would give to it, really, doing nickels and dimes here and there, owning a project or two, having one project in this market and one project in that market, you could never get to the scale that you needed to where community solar would actually be able to live up to its expectations, right? And so we right out of the gates decided that we would only participate in markets where we knew that there was a scalable financial investment opportunity. I think that's proven to be the case in most of the markets. So markets like Illinois, Maine, and Maryland, where we've been the most active, we have been able to put over $1 billion to work across those three markets. We, as a developer, are also an owner-operator in all of the projects that we build. And we're really arranging the full capital stack, no different than a utility-scale solar project would. We have tax equity investors that are investing into our portfolios primarily for the investment tax credit and the accelerated loss benefit. We have lenders who find an attractive risk-adjusted return proposition of making loans against the projects, and then we have financial sponsors, tier one infrastructure investors who again like the risk-adjusted return proposition of owning and operating these systems over their entirety of their useful life. And so we very quickly went down that route. I think we've seen a very quick maturation in the space as well. I think initially, we saw some of the distributed generation developers and owner operators look to tuck in a little bit of community solar as a complement to some of the broader DG portfolio that they would own. We saw some of the utility developers who also owned and operated maybe look just to develop, but not necessarily own and operate community solar, right? Because again, these are smaller projects, right? 2 to 5 megs DC. I think the unique thing about community solar is just because you're a smaller project doesn't mean you're going to have smaller problems, right? You still have all of the same challenges and problems that large projects have, right? From an interconnection perspective, from a permitting perspective, from a supply chain perspective, but all of those problems really get concentrated down into smaller dollar capital investments. So I think one of the strengths of these larger programs is that you offer investors the opportunity to really have diversity within a market, right? So for example, we did over 45 2 megawatt AC systems in the first program of Illinois with one investor and got them to scale through that means.
So are you more focused in the management? So where does your company's business model are you the long-term managing these assets, building these assets? What makes your shareholders happy, right?
Yeah, sure. So I think we're where it all comes together, right? We're at the very front end of project development. We're signing lease options with landowners. We're working with building owners who have otherwise unusable rooftop space, right? Large industrial REITs who allow for us to lease rooftop systems rooftop space from them. We're at the very back end. We're managing financially and operationally the systems that are built. We're also co-investing into the projects that we own, so that we're also, there to take in lessons learned, right? To ensure that the customer experience, the subscriber experience, the investor expectations are met, and then we're doing everything in between. And so I would say all of our efforts really concentrate to get a project to financial closing and issuance of notice to proceed with a contractor, right? If you've gotten the project to that milestone, everything that has had to have taken place beforehand has been solved. Everything that will come together after is in hand. And really, you've convinced all of these, varied stakeholders that this is a project that's worth building, it's worth investing in, right? It's worth all of the brain damage that went in for the past 3 or 4 years with the landowner and the permitting authority and, the local stakeholders who had concerns that you went back and forth with, for several months, with the utilities themselves, with the retail provider or the aggregator who's out there subscribing the customers, and then at the very last minute, your financial investment is made and everyone's happy. So I would say that's really what makes us happy as a company. That's what makes our investors happy, because that's where we make most of our money, is from actually doing all of that work, bringing it all together, getting it to notice to proceed, getting it to financial closing, and moving that project through construction and into operation.
Have you had any pain with supply chain? I mean, everybody I talked to in renewables in the last year has had a few bumps in the road with supply chain, to be polite. How has that impacted your business in the last 12 months?
I would say it continues to affect us, but I think unlike 2.5 years ago, the challenges are better understood. At the start of COVID, certainly we were affected. We were affected not just with the global supply chain, right? What might happen when COVID popped up at a factory in China and they suspended production for 4 weeks. We could see that ripple on effect that many more months down the line when we weren't getting our modules or our inverters, right? But not just on a global scale. We saw, 2 years ago, at the very local level, right, the impacts of COVID and supply chain, where it was difficult to reach landowners, right? It was difficult to convene permitting meetings in person, never mind virtually. It was difficult to get people to make decisions because they were working from home, and they had kids at home because schools were out, right? It was difficult to convince certain authorities that this was critical infrastructure, and they should allow for our systems to continue to be built irrespective of pandemic shutdowns, right? So I would say we're through the worst of it. Certainly, most of what we continue to face in the supply chain realm is more macro now, right? For a while there, it was the forced labor concerns of the Uyghurs, right, in China. And then it kind of pivoted into concerns around anti-dumping and tariff circumvention. And like I said, it's well understood now. It's certainly better understood and it's manageable. I think we are a developer of scale to where we have the capabilities and we have the supply chain presence that we can navigate that a little better than smaller developers can. But certainly it continues to be a challenge, right? Certain pieces of equipment that 5 years ago wouldn't have been a concern to us because we could have gotten on a 13-week lead time. We've got to place orders with 52 weeks lead time now, right? So it's just it's an evolution of solar, right? We've always been challenged by the supply chain because we don't control a lot of it domestically, right? But I think certainly as a larger developer, we're a lot better prepared to manage that than we were 5 years ago.
All right, so you understand the inputs. You're able to handle the nuance of the current supply chain from what you just described. What is a project like the asset life cycle? So when you're doing performas on these, right? It's not like the old days when we build a big steam generation plant or a coal plant or whatever. We knew we were going to have it for 30 years or some period of time. What kind of performer are we seeing in these community solar plants? How long are they going to be in existence, and what kind of performance? I mean, if you're talking rooftops get changed every so often, right?
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, that's really the one limiting factor of the rooftop application of community solar is the useful life of a industrial roof is around 20 to 25 years, right? At which point it needs to be re-roofed, and it's difficult to re-roof with solar installed, right? But on the flip side, what we find with rooftop applications is no one really objects to putting solar on a roof because no one really even knows it's there, right? And so while you may face some NIMBYism within any given local market for developing on farmland or on private property or on any piece of land or property that doesn't have by right development, you don't run into those obstacles with developing on the roof. However, that comes at the cost of a shorter system's useful life, right? If we're only convinced that this project can operate for 20 years, we're foregoing revenue for another 20 years. Really, that all is accounted for in the financial model, right? With our investors and with us as a developer, we're still getting to attractive risk-adjusted returns over a 20-year horizon. For the typical ground application, what we see is that these systems are built and are expected to be maintained for a 35 to 40-year useful life. So we have site control, right, either through outright purchases of the property or through lease agreements with the landowner that allow for the system to be interconnected and operated for the full economic and physical useful life of 35 to 40 years. Most of the community solar markets themselves allow for us to participate in the community solar market for anywhere from 20 to 25 years, after which our systems would be expected to operate no different than any wholesale or QF project. Really, they have a right with the utility to be interconnected, to continue operation, although they may be getting a less lucrative compensation scheme at that point in time. Again, that's all wrapped into the pro forma.
And then you mentioned a number of states in your examples. How's the grid handling this distributed deployments, right? So you hear a lot of horror stories about it, and then I'll have someone from National Grid on saying, well, it's not as big a problem as you might think. We're going to take it in increments, and we're going to get there. It's a transition. It's not a switch that's being flipped. So you're living this. You're right in the middle of all this. How's the grid handling it?
Better and better. I think the challenge is getting it onto the grid, right? That's the first challenge. And that's what we see in most of the markets is that the interconnection queues themselves, right, have so much opportunity that it's almost an incomprehensible exercise for the utilities and for the ISOs to process whether or not they could accommodate that. And even if they could accommodate all of that new all those new sources of generation, what are the second and third and fourth order implications, right, of bringing all that on over even an extended period of time, right? So the biggest challenge right now is just getting through the interconnection queue. I would say at the distribution level, have some advantage generally over the larger projects that, by their nature are larger, will trigger cluster studies or have to go to ISO level studies. More often than not, in the markets that we operate in, when we're proposing 2 to 5 megawatt DC systems, we have a bit more of a seamless path through the utilities interconnection study process and application and design process than a large system would. So that's one of the inherent advantages of DG. Certainly once the solar is interconnected, I would say the markets in which community solar also represents some of the first solar generally, and we saw this in Illinois, in the Ameren service territory, in southern Illinois. There is a learning curve, right? There's a learning curve of how do my inverters talk to the substation and the transformers on their side. Why are their signals getting sent back and forth that are tripping my inverters, right? Why is the voltage not where it should be? It's really, it's an exercise in just working with the utilities to understand what happened. Is this as simple as just changing one setting, or do we need to rethink how we're actually interconnecting? Do we need to redesign the system? On the next system that we build, are we going to trigger more massive upgrades than you had previously contemplated? So I think really storage is going to be the key, right? That helps them solve all of the problems. And these aren't just problems that solar has created, right? These are problems that exist on the grid today, right? The grid is old. The grid is, has not been maintained to the level that it needs to be. The grid has not kept pace, right, with the electrification of the household and of businesses, right? And so these aren't necessarily problems that are being triggered by solar, but I think solar and wind are often really the scapegoat, right? Because that's when the problems really manifest themselves, is when we interconnect, when they do see this, irregular production profile and the grid can't maintain it.
So, all right. So I get all the bits you're piecing together here. Today, is a lot of solar energy still curtailed, or is it all being used? Are you getting to use what you create, or is the grid able to handle it in time? And is there demand when you're creating the power?
Yeah. Speaking for our own assets, and then expanding a little bit within community solar, there is very little, if any, curtailment within community solar and within DG specifically, right? By its nature, we're sitting closer to load, right? We are serving critical infrastructure needs closer into to the actual end user, to where all of those major transmission constraints or substation thermal limits are not an issue, right? We're past that level of the grid generally. I would say the challenges that we're seeing right now are threatened or anticipated curtailment, where certain markets like in ISO New England, we're being told, sure, you can interconnect, but you can't operate your system for the next 5 years, right? So it's not curtailment in the traditional sense, but it's effectively curtailment, right? When we're not going to commission, install, and build a system just to sit on it for the next 5 years before we hope to operate it.
So you came on the podcast. Our audience tends to be mid to senior folks in the energy industry. Who are your customers? Who's your company talking to? Who do you want to pick up the phone and be talking to you?
We have customers across the entire value chain, right? Since we sit at that nexus, right, of community solar and storage project development, construction and operation, we talk to everyone. Everyone is important to us, from the smallest developer who has, one project that they've been developing in a state that we're operating in, to the largest of infrastructure investors who wants to put hundreds of millions of dollars capital to work, and literally everyone in between, right? In addition to developing our own projects, we buy projects from other developers. So we partner with them, to give them the financial compensation that they expect for doing the amount of work that they've done to develop a project. We're partnering with local and regional EPC providers. We're partnering with large, module vendors and transformer manufacturers. We're partnering with the local communities, with the advocates of local communities. We're partnering with labor. Obviously, that's a huge element of the Inflation Reduction Act that doesn't get a lot of attention. But really, the labor force that's going to be necessary to build and maintain all of the renewable infrastructure that's anticipated to be built through the Inflation Reduction Act. And then, all the way through the value chain, like I mentioned, to the investor universe.
And then how do you think personally, as we kind of come to the close of this, we're doing? So 2030, 2050, how's the U.S. positioned to get to renewables? How are we doing for our grid?
I think we don't have any more excuses, right? While we could have finger pointed up until the Inflation Reduction Act, about the kind of the weaning off of the investment tax credit that we were facing, or the cliff that certain technologies were facing, or the inability for certain technologies to access that, right? We don't have a national energy grid or framework or policy, right? And so in the absence of that, what we have are financial tax incentives, right? Now, essentially, we have no excuses for our failure to actually build and install the necessary infrastructure, right? Renewable energy infrastructure to achieve what are both national goals, but also state level goals, right? Really, the obstacles continue to be at the local level, right? They're getting our projects interconnected, working with the utilities, understanding what the problems are that they see and how we can be, a constructive solution to those problems instead of being perceived, as a threat to them. How do we better partner with, local townships and municipalities, right, to allay their fears about solar and property values and the like, right? So really, the opportunity set is there now, right? For the next 10 plus years, the financial incentives are known, they're well understood. It's a liquid market. I think we need to see some continued evolution there. We need to continue to see new corporates enter the tax equity universe. We need to see a liquid and robust market for tax credit purchases, right? Which is another feature of the Investment Tax or Inflation Reduction Act. So those are things that'll happen, right? There's enough interest, there's enough players, there's enough opportunity that those will mature. But really at the local and the hyper local level where these things actually come to fruition, that's where most of the focus I think needs to remain, right? And how do you actually get all of these stakeholders aligned with installing, community solar, standalone storage, small distributed generation assets to make the benefits available, not just to, the broader grid, but to them as a local community.
Awesome. Adam, I want to thank you so much for coming on the podcast. It's been eye-opening to hear what you guys are up to, hear the projects in play. You're overly optimistic, which is great. You've got a very positive outlook of what's happening in the market. Thank you so much for being our guest on the podcast today. It's been a pleasure.
Thanks for the opportunity, Chris. Appreciate it.
For our audience, you've listened to another episode of Insider's Guide to Energy. If you've enjoyed the content, you want to find out more, don't forget to comment, find us on YouTube, find us wherever you get your podcasts, subscribe, share it with your friends, and we look forward to speaking to you again next week. Bye-bye.